Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teach Me Teacher, a podcast for educators, where we, the teachers, become students ourselves. I'm your host, Jacob Chastain, and today we'll be learning everything we can about GT students and how we should approach them in the classroom. So last week, I went to an AP and Pre-AP Summer Institute hosted at TCU here in Texas. If you've ever been to one, I highly recommend it. This was my first time going, so it was a new experience. But I had the opportunity to sit in a class with some of the brightest minds in education and learn new skills, methods, and ideas that changed the way I thought about my classroom. But there was a moment in the 4-Day Institute where I realized that a lot of teachers didn't really know what AP and Pre-AP meant in regards to GT students, myself included. Are all students in these programs GT? How do we know? Do we need to know? I bring these questions and a few more with me today since I'm talking to one of my role models in education, Mr. John Bolles, the academic coach and GT coordinator here at Richland Middle School. John, how are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Awesome.
Just enjoying the food in my stomach that you cooked for me. It was delicious. Anyway, so GT students, Pre-AP, AP, these are things that get passed around a lot. It's a lot of things that teachers, I think they worry that they might not know exactly what all these terms mean and how it relates to them. So I really wanted to dive into it with you as our GT coordinator to kind of explain some of these for some of these teachers, myself included. Sure. So really my first things first. So GT coordinator, what does that mean in regards to your position?
Well, at a middle school, a lot of students are already identified as gifted and talented by the time they get to us because they are tested in elementary school. But there are still some students that need to that show some of the characteristics that are signs of being gifted and talented, but they haven't ever been identified. Maybe they're new to the country, maybe they're new to our school district, maybe they've just moved around a lot, or in some cases they kind of came into their own in adolescence. So maybe in elementary school they didn't really show a lot of the characteristics of being a GT student, but when they got to middle school they started to exhibit some of those characteristics. And so one of my jobs is to test students that are they can at the secondary level they can nominate themselves. So a student who feels like they're just this GT thing that people have been talking about, they can go on a website, they can look at what the characteristics are, and they can say, that I feel like that's me. Mm-hmm. They can nominate themselves, their parents can nominate them, and of course teachers can nominate them and say, this kid in my class, amazing artist, amazingly quick when it comes to answering questions or getting complex ideas, but I notice in their student information, they're not labeled GT. So I do the testing. So that's the first kind of piece. Yeah. The second piece is that I go through and I try to make sure that any student who's labeled GT has at least one Pre-AP class. The Pre-AP and GT are not the same thing. Pre-AP is a class. Mm-hmm. It's a class based on certain standards, and those standards are designed to develop a student until they get to an AP class where they will take a test, and if they do well enough on that test, they can get college credit.
Right.
Okay, so that's Pre-AP and AP.
Okay.
GT is a label, a designation for a student that indicates that they are academically gifted. And and in some places in our district, it's primarily academic GT. So we're talking about reading, math, writing. But GT actually is a designation that could include art. You could be gifted and talented in theater and not necessarily be academically gifted and talented. And so the GT designation is kind of letting a teacher know this student is going to get bored easily. This student is going to have some intense passions, possibly your subject, possibly not. Mm-hmm. And if we can key into some of those intense passions, they will work like nobody's business. Also, but there are other characteristics of a GT student. Things tend to come easily to them, and so as a result, a lot of them don't have a lot of stamina when it comes to hard work. And so when they get to that class where they're not getting it where they always have before, sometimes they can fall apart a little bit, at least initially. And so, it's not all, I've said many times that gifted and talented, I wish they'd come up with a different designation, like other-brained.
Yeah.
Because gifted and talented makes it sound like, well, you're the bigger, faster, stronger version of the regular student. And that's not necessarily true. In fact, those students can have as many social issues in the classroom as they have academic strengths in the classroom.
So what would you say is really the prime difference? But like GT, I mean, you're saying other-brained, and you mentioned some of the details, but really what's the thing that's separating these two types of students in regards to this category as it's being used?
These two being GT and non-GT, or GT and pre-AP?
Either.
Okay, so GT versus somebody who's not labeled GT. First of all, unfortunately, there's a line we draw in the sand. And we say, if you cross this line, you're GT. If you're down here and you're almost across that line, then you're not labeled GT, even though you have a lot of the characteristics. So the first thing, I say to teachers is, if you have a student that is exhibiting GT characteristics, an intense need to learn more about a subject than you go over in class, getting bored easily, getting off task, not doing their homework and making hundreds on all the tests, getting into arguments all the time about anything, arguing about whether or not they're arguing. So a lot of these characteristics are an indication that a student might be gifted and talented. On our website, and pretty much any district's website, somewhere they're going to have their criteria. And so on the Birdville website, we have a gifted and talented page, an advanced academics page. And within that, we have some how to spot a GT student little papers that teachers or parents or even kids can go and read and say, is this... do these characteristics fit a student? But I mentioned several of them, and I think the big ones are that easily bored in class, liking to argue, wanting to interact with adults instead of other students often, because they need to go deeper into the conversation than your average 12 or 13-year-old wants to go into about math.
Thinking back to my classroom, I've had pre-AP classes, there are those students that it's almost when you interact with them, they interact differently. You talk to them and they're the ones that, they're going to ask that question that kind of blows you back a little bit, like you weren't expecting that to come out of your classroom. But they can also be that student that asks those all the time. And it becomes a disciplinary issue, or maybe not a disciplinary issue, but like a classroom management issue to where they are disrupting the environment continuously because of their different way of thinking, their way of interacting with you and other students. So when it comes to GT students in general, like how do you approach a situation? Say you have a student who's super engaged, he's into his content. We'll say he's into this particular content. Say he's really into history. What do you do in that situation to where they're a disruption? Like, how do you hand that? I don't know if I'm phrasing that correctly.
So if you feel like the source of the disruption for this is that they need more than you're able to give them, okay? And I think that happens a lot with a GT student.
Sure.
We've got let's say it's a pre-AP history class, and they're in a class with 20 really hardworking kids that are still interacting on a normal 8th grade level for U.S. history. They're trying to memorize things, they're trying to understand the connections, and they're struggling in the same places that maybe non-pre-AP students would struggle. They just kind of are pushing through that wall. Okay? So that's 20 of the kids in your 24 student class. And then you got these 4 kids. And maybe maybe 2 of them aren't doing their homework and making hundreds, and then you've got this one kid you're talking about. He's always asking questions. He's asking questions you don't know the answers to. It's like he went home and studied up on it so that he could catch every mistake you made and point them out to you in class. And so I think for a teacher, the first step in being a quality teacher for gifted and talented students, and really for any student, is being upfront and honest with, yourself and with your students that I may not know everything, and I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm not going to have all the answers. And if you know something I don't, here is the way you get that information across. And you've got to give them an outlet for being able to show what they know. Sometimes that's about individual work. Working at their own pace or doing specialized projects. But I always hesitate to tell a teacher, just give them more work. Because sooner or later, if you are a gifted, talented student, one thing we know in academics is you're a pretty smart kid.
Yeah.
And you're going to see sooner or later, hey, every time I open my mouth, this teacher gives me an extra assignment.
Yeah.
So guess what I'm not going to do tomorrow?
Yeah.
And we don't want to stifle them in that educational space. So we have to connect to what they are passionate with. And if you're passionate about cars, and I'm a history teacher, then maybe we start talking about Henry Ford and the assembly line. It may not be exactly related to every single SE I'm teaching, but it's still about connections in history. It's still allowing that student to pursue a passion with their interest in the context of a historical investigation, which will help them as young historians deal with other content.
Yeah.
And so I think one piece is connecting to their passion. Not just assuming they're going to be passionate with history because we're passionate with history, but connecting to what they are passionate about. And then giving them an opportunity to present, perform, display their knowledge.
Sure.
Because the classroom's the only place they have for that. So many of these kids at home, they're like, they got this third eye growing out of their forehead. Their parents don't even know what to do with them. Right? Because often you're working with a parent who, they liked school, maybe they didn't. Now they've got this child that was reading chapter books in first grade instead of picture books like everyone else. I don't even know what to do with him. I don't even read these books, and they want to talk about them, and I can't. And so then they come to school and they expect that outlet from their teachers in their classrooms. And so often what we get instead is, well, this is the mold you have to fit in because this is how I have to teach my class. So for differentiating for those GT kids, it's really about stepping away from our comfort zone as teachers. Letting them, and they're going to master the standards for you. That's the beautiful thing about this. We talk about classrooms of choice. That's scary for a struggling student. I'm let you have a bunch of choice when I can't even get you to master the content I have to teach you. But you shouldn't have that anxiety with a GT student. You just make it a prerequisite of getting to do those things they really want to do. Show me you know all this. And for a lot of these kids, that means the next day they take a pretest and they show you they already knew it when they walked in the door.
Right.
And then they move to their passion in the context of your subject. And I don't know, often they end up teaching us as educators more than we teach them, but that's okay.
So, what are the dangers of you're sitting at your lesson plan, you're like, I have this awesome lesson, you don't have your GT kids identified. They might be identified in the system, but you as the teacher are not familiar with your GT students. You're sitting there with your lesson plans, you don't differentiate in your lesson plans because you just don't do it. You're not there yet. So what dangers does this cause in the classroom, or what kind of issues are going to rise up just for the teacher not doing it?
Nothing we plan doesn't happen if we don't plan it. Let me explain that. Okay, so if we don't make special plans for struggling students, that doesn't mean students won't struggle. It just means we're not prepared for it when it happens.
Right.
Well, the same is true with a GT student. If we don't plan for the GT student, they're not going to suddenly decide, well, they didn't plan for me to be GT today, so I'm gonna sit back and I'm just going to behave like a normal student.
Right.
No, that's who they are. And so that's when you get that student that corrects you in the middle of a lesson. It's the one that you were reading the night before because you've never been any good at this. And we've all had this lesson. I was a math teacher for a long time, and there were always those subjects. synthetic division in high school, which I won't go into, but it was something that I didn't do but once a year. I taught it, and I never taught it again, and it wasn't something I used and I was awful at it, and so I'd sit down and I'd figure it out before I went to teach the kids. That GT student's going to be the one, if you don't have an outlet that points out every mistake you make that day, that asks you questions you can't answer, probably says 15 times, but I thought you were the teacher. You're supposed to know more than us, right? Often is the student that gets removed from class because they're being insubordinate and disrespectful, when really they're just differentiating for themselves. Because the person in charge of the classroom, the experienced educator, couldn't take the time to do it, or didn't take the time to do it.
Yeah.
So we want to funnel that. If we funnel that energy, we get amazing things from the students. If we give them just a little bit of boundary so that they know where they fit in, and then let them blast off, then they soar.
So rather than sitting there, going with the same idea of someone sitting with their lesson plans and not putting that in, say maybe they're too tired, they're putting lesson plans at midnight, whatever the case may be, it's almost more work not to do it, or it's at least a bigger headache not to do it.
It's classroom management in general. It's half of what I work on as an academic coach, not just in GT, but in other areas too. It's, just this class, they're not connecting. It's not always students are being knuckleheads. Sometimes it's every time I say something, they all look like their dog just died. None of them are smiling. They all got their head laying on the desk. What can I do? And in all of those cases, when you dig right down to it, it's not about a lack of plan always, but it is almost always about a disconnect between what the student needs and what the adult wants to do. And if we can figure out what the student needs, not what they want, but what they need to be successful, and if we prioritize that with our plans, then maybe there are some other things in the plans you don't need to have. Maybe every page number in the textbook that you're going to cover that day isn't important. Maybe having every single strategy you might ever conceivably use in class that day written down in that plan isn't what's important. But what is important is, do you have a plan for every group of students in your space to be successful? And you have some contingencies if things don't work out.
When you're planning for a GT student, I had a really challenging student this last year, and she was by far the most, that I could tell, intelligent student I had. She was so many levels above what she should have been. And she was super challenging, both behavior, both in what I, tried to get her to accomplish in class and all this other stuff. So I grew a lot with her. But one of the things that I had trouble with her specifically was understanding how to analyze kind of where her brain is, where her mind is, where that GT is really clicking, and how to use that to my advantage as the educator. Because I know what I can do in my content specifically to get that higher level and to engage with someone who loves my content. But she's not necessarily someone who wanted, or, she liked my content, but this wasn't her thing, right? It wasn't her jam. So it was difficult because I couldn't just say, hey, let's dive into really what the author was thinking. It was kind of had to think a little bit differently. So a teacher that's sitting there looking at their GT student and they're trying to figure out a way to do this, what are some strategies that you recommend for understanding the GT student in regards to finding that one thing that clicks for them?
I think the first thing is, in any scenario, right? Have a conversation with the student. And it's not a, why don't you like me? Why don't you like my class? What have I done to you? And anything like that.
Why don't you love me?
Yeah. But the question, comes in, the essential question here is, what do you love? What are you passionate about besides sleeping and eating? Sleeping and eating and your boyfriend, I really can't do anything about those. But the rest of it, what are you passionate about? What do you enjoy? What do you want to spend your time doing? If you could be in one class all day, what would it be? And then once we have that kind of anchor point, I recommend going to that teacher. How's the student behave in your class? What do they do? What do they love? Because if you're teaching reading, and this student says, I just really love math class. And you go and you talk to their math teacher, and what you find out is, well, they get it, and then they want to be left alone to do it. Okay. So how can I give them that kind of intense focus time, which this particular student needs in order to really master and understand content? How can I give them that in a class that's primarily conversation and dialogue? Mm-hmm. Because that may be the crux of the problem, is that this student isn't as good socially as they are intellectually. And they need some, they don't act introverted, but they need some time to process before they're expected to talk about something or answer questions about it or any of those things. Or you might find a student that is a verbal processor, right? And you go and they do their favorite class is theater, and you go to theater and you find out that this kid has not stopped talking since the third day of class, but it's cool because that's what we're all about, and we love to hear his jokes and his stories, and he's always, he wants to be up there in front of the class, and then we can tailor some experiences for that student that let them perform in a class that maybe isn't normally performance based.
Mm-hmm. So what it sounds like you're saying is more like, for lack of a better word, as a teacher, be the dynamic one. Like, go talk to them first of all. Shocking, communication with your students works. But go, communicate with them, and then, if it's not your class that they're passionate about, find the class that they're doing the best in and figure out what's working there, or at least a hint at what you can bring back to your class. That seems like a pretty solid enough strategy anyone could follow.
Well, and I would say it works well for any student. The difference for your GT student is without that connection to something worth doing, then so many of those, I hesitate to say negative. There's nothing negative about being a dynamic speaker. Mm-hmm. There's a lot negative about being a dynamic speaker in a courtroom the judge has told you to be quiet. So, these skill sets are all valuable, and what may have driven you crazy about that young lady might be something that she will hinge her entire successful adulthood on, mm-hmm. right? It just didn't work out well in your class.
Right.
So those GT students are going to connect with those habits more when they're not busy, when they're not challenged, when they're bored. Just like any other student, if you think about the student that is always getting in the most trouble in your class, for whatever reason, they're the ones that probably aren't doing the work. Mm-hmm. And maybe they're not doing it because they can't really engage with it because it's too hard. Or maybe on the other end with your GT students, they're not doing it because they already did it. It took them 3 minutes, and now you've got another 23 minutes that they're supposed to sit here and pretend to do it. And they're going to do something else instead. Yeah.
And I think, anyone that's had GT kids in their class, is there, you see those moments where, you have, I've had moments where we did the lesson, did the practice, it was done for the GT student in 2 seconds. Now they're the ones wandering around, joking, or, doing whatever they're not supposed to do that generally disrupts the rest of the class. And that's a terrible vortex to get stuck in. Specifically, especially if it's one of your bigger classes or one of your more tougher classes. And I feel like this would connect to having a GT student who was in a purely on-level class, or maybe a class that was filled with more people that struggled, and then they were GT, and then because GT doesn't mean makes A's.
No, in fact, a lot of GT students academically struggle.
Yeah,
we talked about this. If things come easy to me, then I don't show my work.
Yeah.
And there are some math teachers out there that are never going to give me anything but an F if I don't show my work. But a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, you can't just say, do it because I said so. Right? Has that ever worked for anybody in a middle school? Why do I have to do it? Because I said so. You could say it if it makes you feel better, but you better come up with a better answer than that for that student if you really want to see some change.
Yeah.
So, for a gifted student who sometimes a gifted student will say things like, I know the answer, and then I have to figure out how I got it. That's hard. It's hard as a teacher to develop a lesson that lets a student do that. But it's also hard on the student because they know they're right, but they also know that you as the teacher, you're about to say, so why? How'd you get that?
Yeah.
And they don't have an answer, right? And so I think this kind of comes full circle to where we started, which was that planning piece. The only way for us to give a quality learning experience to a gifted student, to an on-level student, whether they are in a gifted class or a regular class, whether they're low-performing or high-performing academically, the only way to give them the education they deserve is by planning for their presence in our space. And, just because you teach a regular class, you may not have a single kid that's labeled GT, but you still got that one kid that gets it twice or 3 times as fast as all the other kids in that room. For all intents and purposes in your space, that kid is GT. I mean, he may not have a little green dot next to his name in whatever program you use, but that doesn't mean that he's not going to have all of the same struggles that a GT student would have in a pre-AP class. And sometimes, and you mentioned this, a student won't be in a pre-AP class because they just don't like school that much. It's never given them what they needed. It's never been a particular challenge. They generally get the right answers. They know what they're doing. Why should they work harder when they can just stay in these regular classes and breeze along? Now, part of that's my job, is to try to help identify some of these kids and get them into some classes that'll challenge them. But if they end up stuck in your regular ed class, or you're in a class that's moving at a slower pace, it's even more vital that we get them something that they can connect to, and that they can focus on, and that they can excel at.
So is that the ultimate goal of labeling a GT student, is so staff or teachers can interact with them in a different way or get them into certain areas that they're better in? Like what? Because GT, I think the common misconception is that GT is that great student that always does everything, and it's not, right? They're, like you said, they're not always the ones that make the good grades. Sometimes they don't like school, etc., right? Don't want to repeat ourselves, but so one would ask, why label them? What is the benefit to anybody by saying you're GT? What now?
Well, I don't know. We have been labeling, and there's a lot of thoughts on this. And there are some people out there that will tell you, you should treat every kid like they're GT. Every kid's GT in something. Mm-hmm. But I do know that these are the groups, primarily in public education, that we label. We label special ed students. We label gifted and talented students. We label limited English proficient students, or ESL students. Mm-hmm. We label 504 students that didn't quite fit into the special ed moniker, but for some reason, either a physical handicap or issue, or sometimes, learning disabilities, they fall into that 504 category. And we label them for a very specific reason, so they don't fall through the cracks. I mean, that's the purpose for the labeling, is because in 1820, when you had your single schoolhouse, and the dumb kid was always sitting on the school with the big cone on his head, and, or just stopped coming and nobody cared because education wasn't a right; it was a choice. And as we move away from that, and we start believing that every student deserves the most that they can get in their 12 years of public education, they deserve the best education they can get. Whether that means they're working in for the severe and profoundly disabled students, they might be working on, basic spelling of their name in high school, and life skills of, getting dressed, tying their shoes, identifying basic street signs. Okay? All the way to the other end of the spectrum, where you have a student who could be the next Albert Einstein, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we don't want to be the school system that failed him in algebra because we didn't get him.
Right.
We don't want to be the school system that had, that genius didn't even bother going to college because school was just a waste of time. Because they had this experience through school that they weren't ever going to get what they needed. And they fell through a different crack. But they still fell through the cracks. So, I think it's just as offensive for a brilliant mind to go unnoticed in school as it would be for a severe learning disability to go unnoticed in school.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's why we label them.
I mean, that's a point that, I don't know. I mean, that's one of the big concept stuff I really like, because it's stuff that's not, this isn't the stuff the media talks about. This isn't, maybe a little bit, but it's not out there in the the consciousness of the general public or whatever. This is like really where teachers, I think, flourish when we're allowed to kind of interact with these ideas, because that is a pretty big philosophy, saying, we spend so much time worrying about dropout rates and passing rates and all this other stuff, but you have these geniuses in every district and every school, no matter where you're at, that are hating their life or hating the school or hating education and dropping out because no one's feeding them what they need to be fed. And then they end up putting that, some of them end up putting it in positive things. You have those people, but a lot of the times they put them in negative attributes. And I think you see that in your classrooms too, where these kids, they find ways to get what they need through negative reactions, because they're going to get, they might not get the interaction from the teacher if they're saying something smart every 2 seconds, but you be sure they're going to get a reaction, when they, tell the teacher off or flip off another student or something like that.
Right.
Right. So I imagine that's where some of those behaviors.
Well, and that's the other thing, is that you mentioned this earlier. This GT student is this perfect student. Okay. GT's a bunch of brain.
Yeah.
And the fact that it doesn't work the same way necessarily as everyone else's, and in a lot of ways it works better. But in social situations, sometimes it struggles a lot more. Mm-hmm. Okay, social interactions for GT students are often a problem. More so than in a regular ed space. Mm-hmm. You can't connect as much with your peers when they're learning their alphabet and you're reading the dictionary. And that's obviously an extreme situation. Sure. But, and so you end up kind of this isolated personality at times. And you don't necessarily develop all those social skills that you need to develop. And as medical science, we start labeling and coming up with, ADD and ADHD and Asperger's and the spectrum of autism and all of these other things, right? Then we start to realize how some of this stuff intertwines. But genius often comes with an impairment in other places. And so, assuming that a student can only be GT if they're a good kid is as ridiculous as assuming that you'd only be special ed if you're a bad kid.
Yeah.
Right? The spectrum of behavior and the spectrum and maturity of an individual and the spectrum of their intelligence, they just don't coincide that well. And so a lot of your GT kids are going to be the ones you want to strangle. And a lot of your best students won't ever have been identified as GT, because what makes them a great student is that they fight the good fight, where a GT student hardly ever has to fight that fight. They don't have to struggle to learn in the same way that a lot of our the students that end up top of their class have had to struggle to make sure they get the grades that they need to make.
Moving away from some of the big concept stuff, moving back down into the classroom. I had several, in my pre-AP classes, the place that I've usually camped at is conversation, getting them to have conversations with each other, forcing each other to kind of challenge each other's thoughts, especially with those hardworking kids, the kids that know their content, and for the GT kids. But one of the things I've struggled with in this endeavor, and just having in my pre-AP classes in general, where you have a bunch of really hardworking kids and naturally gifted kids all want to prove how genius they are every 2 seconds, not just to me, but to each other. So it ends up, you get a question answered, they want to challenge each other, and it's constant. There's more like it's a competition between them, but it's not a healthy competition, right? So there's that unhealthy veil of them trying to outsmart each other in a negative way. And a lot of times, in some of my some of the classes I've struggled with in regards to pre-AP or GT combined is they struggle to give each other the voice, and they don't have those social skills because they're used to being the smartest. So they're like sitting in this room with a bunch of other smart kids, and they're like, no, shut up, or sit down, you're dumb, no, that's wrong, and you have these,
right.
It turns into a bickering fight. And then as a teacher, if you don't, it's almost like if I don't catch it in time, it's going to go. And I will freely admit that I have not caught it in time several times. So how, is this a common occurrence in pre-AP in GT students? Is it more likely to happen with GT students? And how do you recommend controlling that environment where you want conversation to happen? You want them interacting with each other?
I don't think it's any more common for GT or pre-AP students to inappropriately interact with each other than it is for a regular student. Mm-hmm. The reason they're inappropriately interacting with each other is because they don't have the skill set yet. So they haven't been taught how to talk to their peers. Our culture does that. Yeah. Because we spend a lot of time talking to young people about how they should speak to adults. Right? I do that with my kids all the time. That is not the way you talk to an adult. Mm-hmm. But sometimes what we leave out there is that's not the way you talk to anybody, right?
Yeah.
You really shouldn't call anybody stupid, at least not to their face, right?
Sure.
And so I think what you find honestly in a pre-AP class is a level of leniency by the teacher that you would not find in another class. Well, these are my good kids. These are my bright kids. These are my smart kids. So a little competition's healthy. It is. But when they start becoming disrespectful with each other, they need the same redirection, the same consequences, the same conversations, possibly the same phone calls home and the same detentions, mm-hmm. that the students that struggle with your content need if they're not interacting. It's separate. So on the one hand, your pre-AP students definitely will do a better job understanding your content. Mm-hmm. That would be, if that didn't happen, then probably we're not identifying the pre-AP students the right way.
Sure.
But now when we start talking about interacting with each other, they don't know how to do this. They got no more training in this in school than anybody else in our school did. A lot of them got no more training at home than anybody else in our school did. If they did get training at home, it almost puts them at the disadvantage if we don't corral that class, because they're the ones that are being told to shut up and they don't have a response because they know they're not supposed to be rude. Mm-hmm. So, there are a lot of avenues for addressing that. From behavior plans and contracts, from classroom contracts, from that classroom management side, but also things like accountable talk. Teaching kids how to argue respectfully, how to disagree appropriately, and actually making that part of the instruction, not just how to take turns, but how to take turns appropriately. A lot of the cooperative structures that we try to teach in our classrooms have those social skills embedded in them. But I think a lot of it's perceptual. I think a lot of it is I shouldn't stop these pre-AP kids from interacting because we need to go deeper, we need to go further, and that means that they have to be able to argue. Well, I actually think that all of your students at some point or another should have to argue their point. I think that's kind of the definition of rigor, is being able to argue a point. Mm-hmm. And so regardless of the level of class, I think that needs to be part of your class. But I think the trap we fall into is well, these are great kids. They always say good morning to me when they walk through the door. Yeah. They never get in any trouble in school. So they, so like you said, we don't catch it. Mm-hmm. And suddenly one of them goes, you're an idiot. But then it's over and how did I deal with that? Instead of pulling that kid up to the desk just like we would anybody else and saying, yeah, we don't call people idiots in my class. So I'm going to need you to apologize. And then let's come up with a different way to argue. Let's think of a way to be respectful at the same time that what we're saying is I disagree with you. And I think that step often doesn't occur for whatever reason in a pre-AP classroom. So
do you think teachers, like, I guess they assume, these are the kids that are making, hundreds on the test. I don't have to, hit the same points over and over again. They get it a lot faster for the most part. Do you think because of that, teachers, I don't think it's a malicious thing. I don't think like, well, it's whatever. We don't need to do discipline. But do you think they just subconsciously or unconsciously or whatever, they they treat their kids differently, but they don't hold them, they hold them to almost a higher standard of behavior by not holding them?
I think teachers, as a group, teachers identify more with their pre-AP students than they do with their struggling learners. There are obviously always exceptions. Mm-hmm. But in general, people who chose the profession of teaching were probably pretty good at school. If you were awful at school to the point where you wanted to drop out, very few of those people turned around, got their teaching credentials, and came back to teach.
Sure.
So we can assume that there's probably more of a connection with those either hardworking or gifted students, maybe both, in that space. I think despite the fact that we're adults, and this is a hard thing to say, but I think sometimes we really need the validation of some of our students. It's we can say, well, I don't even care, I'm the adult and they're the kids, and if they don't like me, I don't care. But that is a level of maturity in that regard that takes quite a while to get to. You want your kids to like you. Mm-hmm. As a parent, you want your kids to like you. It takes a long time. And I'll even go a step further and say, if none of your kids ever like you, you probably aren't that great a teacher. Because if everybody hates you, you probably don't need to be in the classroom, right?
Sure.
And so I think that the need for that validation is there. And I think we are more likely to get trapped by that in a class of bright, hardworking kids than we are in a class with struggling kids. And so I think a lot of times that's part of it too. I mean, just the hard reality is I just don't want to redirect them to the point where they don't like my class anymore. These are smart kids. They work hard. I want them to like my class. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, and we know this is true with our own kids, we know this is true with students in general, is that lack of structure is what will finally push a kid into saying, yeah, no. That class where the teacher lets you sit on the desk, sit under the desk, climb between the desks while other people are taking a test, that class may sound like they're letting you have your space. But what really those lack of boundaries are doing is pushing a kid to you're letting that kid know, I really don't care enough to make you do the right thing. Mm-hmm. Or to make these other kids do the right thing while you need your quiet for you to do your work. And so, I think we get trapped there more easily with a pre-AP class than we do with an inclusion class or a regular ed class.
That's probably a really good point, because I know just from experience that my pre-AP classes generally tend, not all of them that I've had, but I use that one class that I struggle with the most every year is always a pre-AP class so far. And I want, there's probably some of that seeping in to where you want to connect with them. They're speaking at a higher level, so you can have better conversations with them. You can connect to them on a level you might not be able to connect to with a struggling student. Therefore, it's almost the boundaries between you and the student, almost blurred in regards to discipline, in regards to...
Well, I think that's a good point, that the boundary, the academic and intellectual boundary is a lot blurry. Mm-hmm. More blurry.
Yeah.
In fact, it comes to a place where some of those kids in your room, I mean, yeah, I've taught kids every year I taught. There was always a kid or two in there that I would sit there and think, wow, you are so much smarter than I am. And if you ever figure this out, this is going to be a rough class, you know? And so, but I do think that piece, and so that's hard. And I think you brought up a really good point. It's hard when the intellectual and academic line blurs, but the maturity line is still what it is, adult and student. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe that's part of the problem is that, well, since you can have an intelligent conversation with me, you should also know when to stop having an intelligent conversation with me. And that's not always the case, especially with a 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old.
Knowing this, someone listens to this podcast, they go back to their room, and they're, next year, whenever you listen to this, 20 years from now, you're back in your room, you're like, oh, you know what, I've done this. I've committed that crime, right? How do you course correct at that point? Let's say, not even halfway into the year. How do you go into a pre-AP class at the beginning of a year and course correct that? How do you, if you see it happening, right? You're like, you know what, we're having these conversations. I see myself, not giving them the discipline I know they should. I didn't tell them to sit down when they should have, etc. How do you step back? What can you do? I guess a better way to phrase this would be, as the educator in the space, how do you set yourself up for success to identify that issue before it happens?
Well, I think the first thing is don't ever start with lax boundaries with kids, because I think this is something else we do in a pre-AP class. Well, they're not going to need as many rules. Well, I'm not going to have to be as hard on them with discipline because, they won't give me as much trouble. Your policies and your procedures are your policies and your procedures. Mm-hmm. And they have to be the same for all of your students. And if you feel like it's really important to say there's no gum in my class in first period, then you got to say it in fourth period, even though those kids are the most well-behaved students in the world, because there was a reason you said no gum. You weren't trying to torture a bunch of kids in first period. You didn't want gum in your class because you didn't want it on the bottom of your desks. Okay, well, if there's gum in fourth period, even though we may think those kids are way too mature for that, the reality is if there's gum in that class, then there's a potential for gum on the bottom of the desk. And so all of those policies, procedures, classroom management moves that you're going to make have to be consistent. Because a student may be more mature than another student, a student may be smarter than another student, but we don't know that going in. And it's only, a student can, Tom Hirk, Canadian Tom, who's come to our school on several different occasions, has said this a lot. A student can hit a target that he can see and that doesn't move. And your GT and your pre-AP students deserve that just like your regular ed students. We got to give them a target that doesn't move and that they can see. And so with the classroom management piece, that's what we've got to do. Now, that doesn't mean that at the semester you may not realize, hey, this class is ready to kind of branch out and do some things because they seem to be a little more mature. So we're gonna do some classroom debates, and we're gonna push the envelope a little more than I can in some of these other classes. But that's after you know your students. Don't fall into the trap of assuming that you can make it easier the first week of school. Keep everything consistent to start with, and then, as needed, kind of ease up on some of the structure if it's appropriate for your class.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think if I would have gone into my first year with that idea, and who knows, I've probably heard that my first year and just didn't implement it, but I think that is something that does pay well both in on-level pre-AP, GT student, doesn't really matter. It's that consistency portion, right? And just keeping the boundaries up. We are getting to the end of this, and I do have one final question for you, which is, for that teacher, maybe teaching pre-AP for the first time, maybe they're starting that first year, maybe they want to take their pre-AP and their differentiation with GT specifically to the next level. What's your advice for them? I know that's a huge question, but fundamentally, if you were doing it today, what would you start with? That base knowledge that you could work everything from there off of.
I would say probably the biggest piece that I would put in there. You can call it pre-testing. You can call it formative assessment. You can call it early testing. Whatever. Give the kids an opportunity in your pre-AP classes and honestly in your regular classes too, to show you when they've mastered something instead of just forcing them to work until you've decided it's time for them to show you. And so, build those assessments or a writing prompt or have them do a project. However you do it is entirely up to you, but give them the opportunity to engage in mastery early and to show you mastery early, and then go ahead and let them start moving towards those studies and those projects of choice, and let them start working on something that is emotionally important to them. If you know they've mastered the standards for the 6 weeks, then there's no sense that you're not letting, that because they're doing their Henry Ford project or something else, that means, but wait, we're still in the American Revolution. Well, they've already mastered that. You've given them the test. You gave it to them early. They came in before school. And by the way, I'm not suggesting doing it during class. Mm-hmm. Provide an opportunity and provide it to your whole class. Anybody who thinks they can, beat me at the Jeopardy game at 7:30 in the morning, you come in and we're gonna go after this, right? And if you show mastery, then let them move forward to something that is meaningful and important to them and still connected to your content. It can be more work, but honestly, with the internet where it is now, if you can take the standard out of play for a minute because they've already mastered the standard and you can extend that standard, there's so many resources out there that you can help them connect with and that they can kind of fly with. And I think for your pre-AP or your GT students, anybody you want to really differentiate for, letting them move at a faster pace. We can't always let them move at as slow a pace as they want to move because they won't cover the content. Mm-hmm. But if you let them move at a faster pace and let them go to a deeper level with the stuff they're interested in, then we're fulfilling their educational rights as gifted students and not holding them back with our own pedagogy.
Nice. And that's probably the best way to end it. I think it was enlightening on so many things just because I feel like this is a really important topic. It's something that you hear a lot in trainings and seminars and whatnot, but it's not some time that you ever get to sit down with your GT coordinator or whoever it is that, your go-to person and really talk to them. So I want to thank you, John, for coming here and talking to Teach Me Teacher. Hopefully this helps people at our campus and anyone else who listens to this podcast. For much more, visit teachmeteacherpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jacob Chastain. And until then, have a good one.